Thank you very much, Leslie. I know that there's going to be loads of questions. We've already got quite a lot, but we'll hold them until after Andy's spoken. Welcome back, Andy. Good to see you. Over to you.
Thanks very much, Amanda. And just to say, I didn't hear much of Robin and Leslie due to my connection seemed to be very poor, but I'm now on my mobile phone hotspot, which seems to be much better. I've just put a link into the chat of the webpage of the Scottish Government that tells you about the forthcoming land reform bill. The consultation contains a link to it, etc., just for those of you who may be not completely familiar. So Robin talked about or highlighted why land matters and used a number of examples, which I think were very, very pertinent. I would say that Scotland lacks three things in relation to this. It lacks a comprehensive land policy. We've never really decided what we want to do with our land. Our land is basically, land policy is basically made by groups of vested interests who have dominated policy discussions historically. That includes the forestry industry, it includes landowning lobby, it includes, most importantly, actually, the National Farmers Union of Scotland, who are a very, very powerful lobby. But we don't have a comprehensive land policy. The second thing is we don't have a comprehensive system of land information either. And I'm talking about information about ownership, about planning status, about designations, about environmental contamination, about history of sites. It's extremely difficult to find out basic information about land. And thirdly, we do lack a strategic and comprehensive programme of land reform to deliver policy. We've had two significant reviews. The first, the Scottish Land Reform Policy Group in 1999, and then the Land Reform Review Group in 2014. But government seems not to have much of an idea itself about where it wants to go with all this strategically. Now, the background to this, of course, is that, crudely speaking, Europe, continental Europe, did land reform anything from 100 to 250 years in the aftermath of the French Revolution. In France, for example, all the crown lands the church lands rather were given to the municipalities. The church and the crown lands were given to the municipalities. So municipalities in France typically own quite a lot of land. They reformed and changed the law of inheritance. So they abolished primogeniture. That meant that people who owned assets, their children had a legal right to inherit those assets. Children in Scotland do not have the legal right to inherit property. And what happened with the power that went to municipalities was with that went tax powers. So typically, if you walk into a Swiss municipality, a French municipality, will hold information about who owns land in their local area, and they will tax it. So they ended up with a situation where you had, relatively speaking, a lot of landowners. And that's meant that in countries like Norway or Sweden, for example, you have 58,000 farmers who own Södra, which is one of the biggest forest products companies in the world, a huge cooperative. Finland, you have Metsä, again, is 125,000 farmers. And when I say farmers, these are people who own trees. One of the biggest forest products companies in the world. You have Brittany farmers who struggled to get the products to market during a series of bad summers and looked over the channel and saw England and said, let's export our Brussels sprouts and broccoli to England, and bought those, and that's now in which Brittany farm own a majority stake. So across Europe, you have small scale ownership, relatively speaking. You have strong vertical integration, cooperatives, producer cooperatives, marketing cooperatives, and you have financial cooperatives as well, like Crédit Agricole. And you have an acceptance that most decisions, many decisions about land and its governance are made locally. And in that respect, Britain is completely different. Until relatively recently, the House of Lords consisted wholly of men who owned land. And it's not surprising, therefore, that much of our land law reflects the vested interests of men who own land. Now, it wasn't really, I mean, barring Lloyd George and a few other things that happened pre-war, it wasn't really until 1947, with the incoming Labour government, that we got serious about land. So we did things like the Town Country Planning Act of 1947, which is probably the most radical piece of land reform in the United Kingdom, arguably. It basically nationalised development rights and said, you, landowner, you cannot build a house just where you want to, which is what you've done all of these past centuries. You need to have the consent of a local, democratically elected planning authority. But, as Robin hinted at, agriculture, meaning broadly rural lands, including hunting and forestry, etc. So agriculture defined very broadly was excluded from that system and still is. You don't need planning consent to plant a forest. And then, of course, we had the coming of the Scottish Parliament, which, as I mentioned, the Land Reform Policy Group made a series of recommendations to the Scottish Parliament, many of which were implemented. So we had big tenure reform, feudal abolition, tenement law, crofting law, national parks, access rights, all of this happening in the first 4 years of the Scottish Parliament. And it's important to understand as well that land reform is a process. It's a process of reforming the relationship between land and society. So typically that would involve the redistribution of power over land, including the redistribution of land itself. It would include the democratization of land and critical reforms to the tenure system. In other words, a system of law that governs who has what rights over land. It would include reforms to the fiscal regime, so tax is very important. And it would make reforms to administrative law, which is basically things like planning. And also, I think now it's pretty important that any programme of land reform would also respond to the climate emergency. So the redistribution of power, the democratisation of land, responding to the climate emergency. And so from that, it's clear that land reform is a cross-cutting issue. It affects policy areas such as agriculture, housing, the environment. And as I hinted at, the Land Reform Policy Group in 1999 did recognise that broad cross-cutting nature. Everything from tenement law to national parks was in there. And that led to sort of 4 or 5 years of very active policy making in the early part of the Scottish Parliament. Things then basically died after 2006, 7, 8. Very little was done. There was belated recognition that land reform had fallen off the policy agenda, and so they established the Land Reform Review Group, which reported in 2014. Many of whose recommendations have still not been implemented. Which leads me to the current consultation. So I put the link to the page and I'll just briefly go over what's being proposed. But as a matter of context, I think it's quite useful to just appreciate that 2016 established the Scottish Land Commission as a government agency with a statutory responsibility to advise ministers on land reform. Now that was an development because land reform is difficult. It involves dealing with power structures that are deepened. Therefore, it takes time, tenacity, effort, political will. It's not the kind of thing you can do quickly. It requires a very determined, strategic, long-term. And that had been lacking, partly because there wasn't sufficient work being done on what a long-term, strategic, determined approach would look like. And thus the Scottish Land Commission, if nothing else, ensures that policy on land remains in the public eye and people working on it. The current proposals rely very heavily on the Scottish Land Commission's advice to ministers and focus very much on what the Scottish ministers talk about, tackling the scale and concentration of land ownership. And that, of course, is a good thing because the scale and concentration of land ownership is something that's kind of unique to Scotland. The problem, however, arises, I think, because the Scottish Land Commission has done research which suggests that the main problem in of land ownership is that in some places, the power associated with large-scale holdings is not acting in the public interest in relationship to local community. And that's basically the limit of its analysis, which is fine as far as it goes. But it does mean impacts of scale and concentration rather than dramatically reducing the scale and concentration. So basically, what are we talking about in terms of the proposals? Well, as I say, they're focused on what we claim is a series of measures that will tackle scale and concentration. Now, whether they actually do or not, it's very hard to say. I'm not sure they will, but nevertheless, part 4 of the consultation proposes definitions of what's covered by large-scale holdings. And they basically propose a fixed threshold of 3,000 hectares. And in discussions with government, it's become clear to me that that's 3,000 hectares partial. It's not an aggregate. So there are many people who are building up portfolios of land in Scotland whose portfolio exceeds 3,000 hectares, but comprises numberings of each of which fall below that threshold, so they wouldn't be captured. So a fixed threshold. Secondly, land accounts for a fixed percentage of, for example, a local authority ward. That's the second criteria. And the third criteria would be that land parcels that account for more than a specified minimum proportion of a permanently inhabited island. So meet any of those 3 criteria and you're a large holding, and the government's seeking views on that. Now, we can have a debate about the justification for any of those, but that's what they propose. And those that definition is key to the three key elements of the proposals. In other words, these 3 elements that I'm going to be talking about now apply to large-scale land holdings. And these 3 proposals are first in part 6 of the consultation, compulsory land management plans. So if you're a large-scale landowner, you must have land management. Not a great deal is said about what should be in these, how they should be developed, or what impact they might have, or what the penalty for complying or whatever. But nevertheless, that's all open for discussion. The proposal is that there should be compulsory land management plans. And that would be of some utility. I mean, there's no harm in that. It would be, I think, quite a good thing. The second proposal is that sorry, that was the second proposal, compulsory land management plans. The first proposal is strengthening the land rights and responsibilities statement. Now, this is a statement of principles included in the Land Reform Act of 2016 that's entirely voluntary. It has no statutory force, but they're now proposing that it will have statutory force in relationship to large-scale owners. And you will have to comply with these principles. And there will be potential remedies for any breaches. Now, again, these principles are fairly broadly drawn. Who decides whether they're being breached, etc. But nevertheless, it's strengthening that statement. So strengthening that statement, compulsory land management plans. And the third one is a new public interest test to be applied where either an owner of a large-scale holding intends to sell, or the buyer of land who already owns a large-scale holding intends to buy more. And the proposal is that there should be a public interest test applied at the point where the intention to sell or the intention to buy by parties who are already large-scale owners intend to purchase land. And if there's a public interest in relationship to, and how they define a public interest test is, and I quote, to assess whether at the point of transfer of a large-scale holding, a risk would arise from the creation or continuation of a situation in which excessive power acts against the public interest. So again, this is about power in a single parcel in relationship to a local community. And if that test is met, then there will be options, for example, the community to own some of the land, for compulsory lotting, or for conditions to be set on the sale. It's fairly broadly articulated in the consultation, not a lot of detail there, but these 3 proposals are proposals that the Scottish Land Commission recommended to government, and the government's now trying to implement. The other ones Part 8 of the consultation paper talks about new conditions on receipt of public funding, so to make public funding, and they just talk about peatland restoration and forestry grants at the moment. I mean, the big one, of course, is agricultural subsidies, which is over £500 million of public money every year, and they're a little bit nervous about saying included or not, because it's not in the minister's portfolio, it's someone else's portfolio. But nevertheless, more conditionality on those in receipt of public funding, which can't be a bad idea. Part 9 proposes a new land use tenancy. So people who want to tenant land will have greater freedom to do things like restore peatland. And that's not clear to me why you need a new tenancy as opposed to simply amending existing ones, but nevertheless, that's what they propose. Of course, will anyone grant these land use tenancies? Arguably not, or maybe not many. Part 10 is a consultation to come, a separate one on the future of small land holdings, which are governed by legislation early part of the 20th century, quite niche and only apply to very few people in Scotland. And number 11 is about transparency, and this is the sense of déjà vu here, because what they're now proposing is that no one in Scotland should be able to own land unless they're registered for tax purposes in the EU or the UK. Now, that was a proposal that I and others have been pushing for the best part of 20 years. It's not clear now, though, why you need to include the EU when we're not a member state of the EU. The argument by government is they want to keep pace, but there's no need to keep pace in this regard. Countries like Malta, which are member states of the EU, are not beacon of transparency. Nevertheless, they're looking at that. And finally, 12 is other land-related reforms. And so they're looking, for example, for views on how the tax system could support the land reform objectives. And there's a little bit of confusion about this. I was at a public meeting by the government the other night, and the civil servant stood up and in a slide talked about proposals for tax reform that said not for this bill. And yet in the consultation paper, they're looking for they're looking for proposals for measures that could be included in this bill. And you may recall, if you've been following this closely, that the 2016 Land Reform Act did include measures to introduce sporting rates, for example, under the non-domestic rate regime. So we've done this before, and I think it's very important that land reform does include tax measures. So just finally, these measures, I think, are of some utility. I don't think they will have a big impact on the scale and concentration of land ownership. If you want to do that, arguably you should use the two techniques to do that, which are inheritance law reform. So every generation, the children have the legal right to inherit land. Now, that's going to benefit the children of people who own land, absolutely. And it takes a long time to have an impact on the pattern of land ownership. But there's no better time to start than now. And those proposals have already been drafted. The bill's already been drafted, but government's done nothing about it. And the second proven technique is tax. Tax is absolutely proven to reduce the scale and concentration of land ownership. So finally, do please read the consultation paper. It's not that long. It's reasonably well written. I am publishing a series of blogs on my andywhightman.scot website. I've published two, an overview and a more focused one on scale and concentration data. And I'll be looking at issues like tax and management plans over the next few weeks. But it is important that even though people may be despondent and critical of the government proposals, that they do actually submit some measures, some thoughts in response to the consultation. So I think I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Andy. That was very helpful.